The Public Enterprises Minister, Pravin Gordhan, and the Treasury are appealing to heads of major banks and asset managers to help fund ailing state enterprises. Now, a government delegation that included Mr. Gordhan has met financial sector CEOs to appeal for both funding and solutions on restructuring the balance sheets of these highly indebted state-owned enterprises. Now, the meeting is an indication that the banks have not yet restored lending, as concerns to remain over their exposure to the sector and in particular to Eskom, the country's biggest power utility. All the SOEs are in severe financial difficulties, and government guarantees apparently are no longer considered adequate insurance against the risk of default. Right then, so let's dig into this story in much greater detail. Angelo Coppola joins us now live from Johannesburg. Angelo, so debt guarantees for state-owned enterprises like Eskom and SA, they've sucked up billions of taxpayers' dollars, which would have delivered a much better return if spent elsewhere. So given this massive cost, why is the government so averse to a partial or a full privatization of these companies?
Well, Raman, it plays to one of their ongoing election promises, ones that they've been making since 1994, that they'll control all state entities, and also that privatization, either partial or complete, will never be considered, because that plays to the capitalist agenda. And that's something that's an important faction within the ANC would use against the other ANC faction, which is more capitalist than socialist. It then becomes a fight for the top structure of the ANC, and that's in the build-up to the elections next year. The reasoning goes that if they can't advance the black economic empowerment drive or level those playing fields, and if they can only do that if they completely control state spending for all the big SOEs. Meanwhile, in the background, of course, the opposition EFF have been using anti-capitalist nationalization sloganeering, as it were, to garner voter support, and they're doing it rather successfully. And that's got the ANC sufficiently worried in the build-up to those elections to be more cautious about selling off the so-called family silver. Raman?
Indeed. So if selling off these companies, for lack of a better word, is not an option, and in specifically Eskom's case, can the balance sheet be properly restructured if it can't sell its electricity at a higher price, as unpalatable an outcome as that may be for a lot of power consumers?
Well, that's what Pakamani Khadebe, the CEO of Eskom, is trying to do. His balancing act is between increasing that revenue, reducing the cost, and collecting debt. It's the same issues that are facing most operational businesses around the world. In his case, though, he can't increase tariffs without the regulator, and he needs permission there. He can try to cut costs by reducing staff overheads, for example, but he's battling the unions. And he also has to contend with an interfering shareholder in the shape of the Public Enterprises Minister. And when it comes to collecting those huge outstanding municipal debts that he needs to collect, he can't cut off power indefinitely because it's unconstitutional. Added to which, municipalities are made up of, you got it, ANC voters. So, rock, meet hard place. Raman?
Indeed, it almost sounds like rock, meet hard place, meet Gordian knot. But one idea that he has floated is to have state entities that have lent cash to the firm convert that debt into equity. But is that an idea that outfits like the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation, the Development Bank of South Africa, the Industrial Development Corporation, is this something they're keen on doing?
Well, none of these institutions have spoken publicly about the idea, which was first touted by those Eskom executives in February. It's not even clear if closed-door discussions have been held in this regard. Eskom, of course, would probably first have to show intent and also show progress in the restructuring of that balance sheet. It doesn't have a lot to show for its intent, though. It's announced some cost cuts. Those are small change, really, when considering that there's some $29 billion worth of debt sitting on its books. It's attempting to tackle one of its biggest expenses, that's the cost of primary coal, but it's hamstrung by contracts. And when it's tried to strong-arm the unions into those salary increases or no salary increases for the first time in decades, the Public Enterprises Minister, of course, as you know, stepped in. So those debt holders can't be that impressed with the intent. Anyone taking equity wants to see dividends, and Eskom can't show positive returns for at least a decade. So why should they convert that debt to equity? Unless, of course, they're being forced to do so by the shareholder, which is the government, Raman.
Indeed. Focusing on the cash flow statement again, going back to the rock-hard place analogy used, the finance minister just last week pointed out there is no money to satisfy the union's wage demands over at Eskom. So if that is the case, then why did Eskom's management turn around and offer a 4% wage hike? And if that's on the table, what expenses have to be cut in order to cover that cost?
Well, Radebe, that's the CEO, was put, and his team were put in a pretty untenable position last week. They were basically told to make an offer by the Public Enterprises Minister, that's Pravin Gordhan, who used to be the ex-finance minister. Whether this was politically motivated or not, we'll have to wait and see. But NUMSA boss, Irvin Jim, reminded Gordhan that the ANC, that they also couldn't expect to get voters' support next year for those elections if there wasn't an acceptable salary increase for Eskom workers. And it's not going to stop at the 4% if the unions are to believe. It's probably going to be closer to 7%. So with the costs and where they're going to cut costs to cover that increase, no one's quite sure. There may be some fat in the approved annual operating budget, which possibly makes allowance for a small percentage increase somewhere in its budget. Those cuts that Radebe announced in general maintenance and some corporate matters, he made that announcement also in about May or so, could be used to fund some of the wage demands. If Eskom, of course, freezes some new posts, they could fill and not fill some vacancies. They could probably use some budget that they've got left there to fund the increases. It's all about juggling the books at the moment, in a sense. It's a bit of a moving target at the moment, though, Raman.
Indeed. One last question for you, Angelo. Trimming costs, raising revenue yields. That's also essentially the main goal of South African Airlines. New CEO, Vuyani Jirana. What is the latest on his reform plan?
Well, essentially this morning he announced that they were starting talks with one of its operating divisions, an operation called Air Chefs, which cater for the air fleets that are linked to the SAA group. The talk there is of retrenchment. There's no question about it. Jirana actually hasn't provided details yet because the labour law processes in this country have to be followed. Clearly, though, he does believe that there's value in the business, or he would probably have recommended to his board that it be sold off, which implies that there's probably some inefficiency that he can probably take out of the system and make it profitable again. He's also announced route reductions on some of the marginal and more competitive routes, but he hasn't provided details on actual savings yet or cost reductions. 3 weeks ago, as you'll recall, he also announced that he was looking at alternative employment for some of his surplus captains, co-pilots and cabin crew. Reportedly, he's talking to Kenya Airways and to Emirates, but we have to probably wait for a couple of months before we see whether those measures that he's talking about are working or not. As you recall, the airline doesn't have a very good track record about being transparent or on time with its financial results. So we'll have to wait and see how that one plays out, Raman.
Indeed. Rock, hard place, Gordy knots. Thank you for the guide there. That's Angelo Coppola live in Johannesburg.